Hey there, Judith.
Good morning.
Welcome, everyone. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. So we are, this weekend, this Shabbat, we will be concluding the book of Exodus, the book of Shemot. There are two parshiot, and they're combined for calendrical reasons. And they're vaYak'hel and Pekudei, and they essentially deal with the various elements of constructing the tabernacle. We really wind up reading about constructing the tabernacle like 5 different times. I need to actually count them and give you an exact number, but it is more than once for sure. And the story behind that is just how amazing and loving and what can I say? This notion that the divine can enter the world in this particular way. And so when you love something, I used to like to say, if you can remember being in love with someone and getting a letter from them, you didn't just read it one time, you read it lots of times, because every time you read it, you'd get something else out of it. And likewise, that's what this is like. So I'm going to start with a screen share, and we have something unusual. And that is, you'll see. So here's vaYak'hel. vaYak'hel Moshe et kol adat b'nei Israel. Moses gathered the entire community of the children of Israel. Vayomer aleihem, and he said to them, Ela hadvarim, these are the things, asher tzivah Hashem la'asot otam. These are the things which the Lord has commanded to do them. Rashi. vaYak'hel Moshe. So it's sort of an interesting verbiage here, the actual form of the verb. So he tells us, Lemacharat Yom HaKippurim, that this happened the day after Yom Kippur. And elsewhere, Rashi proves that what happened was, in other words, the day after he had come down from the mountain, this is after God had forgiven him. This is like 40 days for sure after the golden calf. So what happened was Moses was actually up on Mount Sinai for a total of 120 days. So the first 40 days he got the Torah, as you know, and then they built the golden calf. He came down and he had to smash the tablets. And then he went, after he had dealt with that situation and cleaned it up, he went back up onto the mountain to ask God's forgiveness. And that was another 40 days. And then after that, he went up again for another 40 days, the last 40 days, and was able to receive much more Torah and other kinds of things. So if you figure it out, if I'm not mistaken, if you go from Shvasar B'Tammuz through to Yom Kippur, you get this even number of days. And I think it could be, I can't do the math quickly. There are about 30 days in a month. Tammuz is halfway through that month. And of course, Yom Kippur is on the 10th of Tishrei. So Tammuz, Av, Elul, you've got Av and Elul. So you've got like about, that's like right there is 30 plus 29, so something like that. So you've got 69 there, and then you've got another. So we're looking at 80 days later, 80 days after Shavasar B'Tammuz, and that's after that second set of 40 days when Moses is able to gain atonement. So Yom Kippur, in many ways, represents that moment of atonement for a sin as severe. There is no greater sin, pretty much, than worshiping the golden calf. And that's why it's sort of this day of atonement historically. At any rate, right after that is when Moses starts in commanding them about the construction of the Mishkan. So here we go. Sheyarad min hahar, that's when he came down from the mountain. Hu lashon hif'il, and I've mentioned this before. This is a grammatical issue that basically there are 7 types of constructions involving verbs in Hebrew. Not every verb is able to sustain all 7 types, but essentially we've got something called the kal, which is the straightforward. So let's take a word like lovesh, okay? And so lovesh means to dress, okay, or to wear, right? So that's the kal form. Then there's the passive form, like he was dressed, that would be passive. And then there is a form that's an intensive form. But I don't think it exists for lovesh. And then there's the passive form of that intensive form. And then there's the causative form, and that's what we're talking about here. So in other words, to wear would be the kal form, and to dress someone would be the causative form. In other words, to cause someone to be dressed. And lehitlabesh is to get dressed. That's a reflexive form, where you're doing the action to yourself. And then for 3 of these binyanim, there's the passive form. The reflexive form does not have a passive form to it. So a lot of technical grammatical stuff there, but it has to do with how you interpret then the meaning of the word, and he's going to explain this. V'hu lashon hif'il. So this yud here, the pa'al is the word that means to do, and hif'il is the form it takes in this causative form. Okay, she'eno osef anashim b'yadayim, because it isn't. So the point is, it's vaYak'hel, which he points out is actually a causative form. Okay, as opposed to vaYak'hel, which would be to gather in a physical kind of way, like gathering stones, where you go and you collect them. So when it says, it's not he collected the people, I suppose if we were to try and translate it into English, but he gathered them, but rather they gather by means of his word. V'targumo v'achnes. So there's some issue as to why he mentions this at all. It has to do with possible versions of the Targum that Rashi had in front of him, and that Rashi here is pointing out the correct version of the Targum, and it's even more technical than I need to go into right now. But let me go on now with what this is saying. And here's what's interesting. He gathers them essentially to tell them to do work on the tabernacle. He's gotten the instructions, and now he's delivering those instructions to the people. So, but this is what he says. Sheshet yamim te'aseh melacha. So I mentioned the passive form of a verb. So te'aseh, right, from the word asot, to do, te'aseh is the passive form. So it means 6 days, sheshet yamim, te'aseh melacha. To translate that accurately, we'd have to say work, melacha, may be done. May be done. You follow me? It doesn't say do your work. It's that work may be done. Uvayom hashvi'i. But on the 7th day, yelachem kodesh, it shall be sanctified to you. So we understand that one of the root meanings of when we say something is sanctified is it means it is treated in a unique kind of way. It is, so we can use words like separated or dedicated or things like that. But the idea is that something is treated in a unique kind of way as opposed to everything else of that category. So in other words, we're talking about days now. So days have something in common in that work can be done on them. But Shabbat is Kodesh when you don't do work, when you don't do labor. That's how you're treating it differently from all the other days. And he says, Shabbat, Shabbaton, Lashem, it shall be well, again, we've got this duplication of the word, right? And it shall be a Sabbath. I don't want to say Sabbath of Sabbaths, but shall be let's just say a true Shabbat to Hashem, or a complete Shabbat to Hashem. And Shabbat, the word Shabbat means cessation of labor, right? Kol ha'oseh b'melacha yumat, Anyone who performs labor on it shall be put to death. Lord, and the final part here, Lord tova'aru esh. This is the only or one of the very few specific examples of what is meant by labor. And it says, you shall not burn a fire, you shall not burn a fire or cause a fire to be burned, b'chol moshvotechem, amongst in all your inhabitations, b'yom HaShabbat, on the Sabbath day. There is a ton of stuff to unpack here because the next thing goes on about the building of the tabernacle. So this is the second time we've had the construction of the tabernacle interrupted by statements regarding the Shabbat.
My mouth is just like wide open. I'm shocked. The jaw has just dropped. By death?
So, yes, desecrating on a strict level, violating the Shabbat is a capital offense. Now, there are all kinds of rules regarding what happens. Here we are talking about an intentional violation of the Shabbat. So there are three categories here. One is, of course, that you did it unintentionally. So you didn't know it was Shabbos, you didn't know that particular act was an act of labor, et cetera, and that punishment for that is not death. You are put in a position of bringing an atonement offering. What happens if you know it's Shabbat and you still violate Shabbat? And you know that you're supposed to not work on Shabbat. You know about that. So now we come into a situation where it is an intentional violation. So in order for a court to be able to punish you and to actually give such a sentence, you have to be forewarned. In other words, the court has to be appraised that you were fully knowledgeable when you did it, so as to be able to say you did it intentionally. In other words, a court has to be truthful. A court has to establish the truth. So you had to be forewarned. Two people had to come to you and say, do you know it's Shabbat today? And you'd have to say, yes, I know it's Shabbos. And they'd have to say to you, do you know that doing this particular thing is forbidden on the Shabbat? And you'd have to say, yes, I know it's forbidden, but I'm going to do it anyway. And they had to be able to report that to the court, and there had to be two witnesses also who actually saw you do it. So
as long as it wasn't to save a life.
Right. There, of course.
Right. I mean that nullifies everything.
Right. We're talking about open violation. So,
Okay.
So if a court could establish all those sorts of things, then it would become a capital offense, and the court was ordered to serve that sentence. However, in situations where it was intentional, you knew it was intentional, you knew you were doing it was but it could not be established. You weren't forewarned. There were no witnesses. It was not a case that could be proved beyond a shadow of doubt. And in that particular case, the punishment is divine. There is a divine punishment, and the punishment is called karet. Okay. So again, in some ways, you've been prepared for this in some ways, because I've told you, remember, I've spoken many times now about how we view ourselves in the light of the universe and in the light of the creator of the universe. And instead of seeing ourselves as privileged and entitled and all those kinds of things, which are clearly Western, or at least our cultural things, cultural norms these days, you see yourself as being privileged in the sense that you were created, and with a deep, deep, deep sense of appreciation of how blessed you are and how fortunate you are, and that is noblesse oblige. So I don't know that any court ever in actual fact carried out such a sentence, although there are examples in the Torah. There's one example of a man who went out and gathered sticks, etc., and this person was in fact executed. I know that without sort of our natural, how can I put it, feelings are, wow, how cruel, how awful, etc. I think that's certainly a legitimate way to feel, but I think it starts to miss the point. And the point is, how do we sensitize ourselves to what are the implications of violating the Shabbat? To what, and again, because we don't consider belief in God to be something that is of great moment, okay? Again, in that kind of context, we're not going to understand this. But I think the real takeaway, Lisa, the real takeaway is for us to look at the Shabbat and say, maybe I need to review my sense of how important the Shabbat is. There was a great statement. I'm trying to think of who the author, I think it was Ahad Ha'am. He was an essayist who lived in the 19th century, early Zionist. He wrote many essays, and I think he's the one who said, more than Israel has kept the Shabbat has kept Israel.
Mhm.
So, that alone doesn't justify or explain, the sensibilities that we have in confronting this. It is one of the 10 Commandments. It truly, if you think about it, this is not the place for me to go into lots of details about it.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
didn't really need much more than to
Okay.
say how, how strong, that
Right.
sentence was. Thank you.
No, I appreciate it. I think I would say that I was the one who needed to say it, because when these passages are said, while you may be in a better position to be able to feel this one through, there are so many people who would find this, would be very critical and judgmental about it. So, all right, we're going to do a little bit more Rashi. Here we go. So, Sheshet Yamim, 6 days. Hikdim lahem azharat Shabbat. So Rashi explains this out of context statement here. He says Moses preceded for them the warning regarding Shabbat, right? This negative commandment regarding the Shabbat. Letzivui melechet hamishon, before he went on to the construction of the tabernacle. Lomar, to tell them, she'eno doche et haShabbat, that it does not override the Sabbath. The construction of the tabernacle does not override the Sabbath. Consider that for a moment. Is the construction of the tabernacle a truly holy act? And the answer, of course, is yes. Is the observance of the Shabbat a truly holy act? The answer is yes. But you might think, therefore, and not only that, did they do things in the tabernacle itself that for doing outside the tabernacle or in the temple would have been a violation of the Shabbat? And the answer is yes. The answer is slaughtering is forbidden on Shabbat. Did they slaughter sacrifices that were brought on the Shabbat? The answer is yes. Did they burn things? Did they put things on the altar to be consumed, etc.? Yes. Are you allowed to do that on Shabbat? The answer is no. So clearly while the actual performance of the rites of the temple would override the Shabbat. However, the construction of the tabernacle does not override the Shabbat. That's why it has to be stated. Okay, last little piece, and then I'm going to have to go out of here. This is sort of very interesting. Lo teva'aru esh, you shall not burn a fire. Gives you the references here. Okay, on Shabbat. This is as I said, so you should know, there are actually 39 different distinct categories of labor that are forbidden on the Shabbat. By the way, carrying in a public domain or from a private domain to a public domain and vice versa is also forbidden. You can carry within a private domain. You're not allowed to carry in a public domain more than 4 cubits. So,
The next
where the eruv comes from?
Yes, that is where the eruv comes from. But they actually are not what I believe an eruv is capable of doing, because there was a rabbinic domain called a Carmelite, which looked like did not have all the requirements of a public domain, and nor did it necessarily seem like a private domain. And so the rabbis took this particular area and created something called a Carmelite. And it had all the strictures of a public domain and those of a private domain. And that's what you can put an eruv around, because since it's a rabbinic category of one of the four domains, you can there are actually three domains, and then this fourth rabbinic domain, you can take an eruv, which is and set it up to create a private domain out of it. Hi, Lee. Thank you for joining us. So just I may have to go over this tomorrow, but they're saying, Yesh mi rabotenu omrim tiva'aru, that this havara. So there's some of our sages who say that the reason why burning, why kindling a fire is singled out, lelav yatsa, that it was distinguished from all the other categories of forbidden labor, of saying you cannot work on Shabbat, as a lav, meaning that burning a fire was not subject to the capital punishment, that it was simply a straightforward negative commandment. The punishment for intentional violation of a negative commandment is stripes, but it's not capital. Okay. So they're saying the reason why this was singled out was to tell you it's not a capital punishment. The Yeshomrim, but there are those who say lechalek yatzat, and there are others who say that it is coming to tell you that each and every violation of the Shabbat, each one of the 39 violations, okay, carries with it its own separate consequences. And I need to explain very quickly what I mean by that. Given the fact that in most cases one treats the violation of Shabbat as unintentional, what it's saying is that each unintentional violation of, let's say you unintentionally violate two different categories, well, you have to bring two sets of atonement offerings, that you can't just clump them all together. And that's why this specific example was brought out. And I will have to stop here. To be definitely continued. As I said, there's a lot to unpack.
That's where I got bogged down in Rambam.
Okay.
With the eruv and the
Yes.
cubits and the God.
We have some interesting stuff to look at. I'm going to stop the share, and I'm going to say good morning, and I'm going to stop the recording. Boker Tov, everyone.
Boker Tov.